Wildfires in California aren't new. We've always had them. But here's what's changing. They're getting bigger, and they're moving faster, and they're happening in places we just frankly didn't expect. And this year, Los Angeles saw firsthand just how devastating they can be. A series of massive wildfires burned more than 20 days, destroying over 12,000 structures. High winds, dry conditions, and aging infrastructure all combined to make firefighting even more difficult. And that raises an important question. Are our water systems ready for this new reality? Climate change is setting the stage for more extreme fire seasons. Hotter temperatures, longer droughts, and stronger winds mean when fires ignite, they spread rapidly. And that has big implications for the way we think about our water system. Because when fires break out, water is our most powerful tool to fight them. But is our infrastructure really designed to handle that demand? Today on What Matters Water TV and Podcast, we're diving into what happens to our water systems during and after a wildfire. Can we design water infrastructure to handle both severe droughts and high fire demand? What happens when burned landscapes impact water quality? And what should communities be doing to prepare for the next big fire? To help us answer these questions, we're joined by two experts. Dr. Erica Fischer, an associate professor at Oregon State University, where she studies how buildings and infrastructure can be designed to be more fire resilient. She just spent a week in Los Angeles researching the impacts of these latest fires. And Kurt Kowar, who has been in the middle of it. He's the public works director in Louisville, Colorado. And in 2021, when the Marshall Fire put their water system to the ultimate test. Wildfires are changing. The question is, are we ready? I'm Charlie Wilson, and this is What Matters Water TV and Podcast. Let's dive in. Well, Kurt and Erica, thank you for joining What Matters Water TV and Podcast. I'm thrilled, actually, we get a chance to talk to both of you and talk a little bit about wildfires and their impact and sort of what it means and some lessons learned from your perspective, because you've both been working on these for some time. Eric, I got to start, I think, with you today. I mean, wildfires, obviously, in Los Angeles were particularly devastating, or at least on the macro sense, and it's in the headlines of the news. I got to ask for both of you, but Erica, you first. From your perspective, I mean, what really do you see as sort of the biggest challenges when we're talking about trying to respond to fires the size and complexity of something like a Los Angeles?
Well, first off, thank you so much for having me on today. I think what we have to understand and what people who live in these areas need to fundamentally understand is that there is no water system in the world and there is no fire response team in the world that can fight those types of fires. A wind-driven event where the entire town is on fire. And we shouldn't be building our water systems for that either. And particularly in an area like such as Los Angeles that has earthquakes as well. The size of the pipes and the amount of infrastructure we would have to put in there is just not sustainable, nor is it economical. And so really what this comes down to is a multi-pronged approach. We need to continue to mitigate in the wildland, but we also need to be engaging homeowners, local governments, and fire response in the conversation. And part of that is the public works team. It's a collaborative effort to mitigate and to overcome these kinds of hazards. But for residents to sit back and to think that the fire response is going to be there for them in this type of event, and that we will have the capacity to fight it, is just completely unrealistic.
Right. Well, Kurt, you've actually had to live through and that coordination. I mean, your perspective. I mean, are these particularly devastating? Are these going to see, from your perspective, are they going to be, what are the bigger challenges that you see in responding to them, having been through this already?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me as well. I'd agree with Erica. It's a multi-pronged approach. And I think the biggest challenge right now from the owner perspective or the operator perspective is kind of dovetailing what we're learning as climate change continues to impact us and the frequency and severity of these events continue, where is our role going to be? It used to be we were just a water provider, and you had to provide a system that could fight a fire for, say, a large department type store on fire, but now we're having to consider entire neighborhoods or whatnot on fire. So as Erica said, that's not sustainable, but doing nothing is also not sustainable. So we need to figure out what that middle ground is and try to understand, working with some of the other approaches, how the water system can be resilient through planned capital improvements through the future for various cities, and also understand kind of as an industry where we're going to go. Are we going to set some minimum standards? Right now, many communities, they develop over time with the threats that they face as a community, and I think a lot of times we're all learning when something happens to us, but now that we're starting to collect a list of lessons learned, what can we contribute to each other to set some minimum standards around that?
Well, I mean, both of you sort of touched on it. It strikes me then that, we sort of have, as the public, this misconception that somehow government's just there going to provide that warm, comfortable blanket and everything's going to be okay. And that if you don't provide it and everything's not okay, then by God, somebody's got to be to blame, right? And I got to go looking for heads to put on a pike someplace. So I guess the question you sort of touched on a little bit, Erica, but what are the misconceptions? Is it just that somehow it'll never happen to me? I don't have a responsibility? Is it that somehow government just can't get the job done? I mean, is it, or are we just expecting too much from our local government and these kinds of things, given sort of the trajectory of climate change?
It's a big question that you're asking. We could talk about it for this entire 45 minutes, honestly.
See, Erica, that's why we're talking right now.
Yeah.
Because we're answering those important questions.
Yeah, I think, like we'll start like all the way back at the beginning. I think the first misconception is that we can stop these fires within the wildland. We can't stop these fires within the wildland. We have had over a century's worth of fire exclusion policies within the United States, which that means that we were putting out almost every single fire that occurred. And what that did is it built up demand in the wildland. So, to equate it to another hazard, it's as if we were trying to stop hurricanes from happening. The landscape needs fire to thrive and to be healthy. And so when we build up the demand in the wildland, the fires that result are faster, intenser. You layer climate change on top of it, as Kurt mentioned, and it gets even worse. So the fires in the wildland can't be stopped anymore, yet we have many, many communities in high-risk areas. And those communities have been built up in high-risk areas because we've been putting out all our fires, and we've been kind of giving the impression that we can manage this, and we can't. So you have kind of both of these events and these challenges happening at the same time. And so really what it comes down to is that that if people are going to live in these areas, they need to take responsibility and take action and be empowered to do so. And so providing opportunities and resources to homeowners to be able to mitigate themselves, to lessen their own risk on their own properties, but also being able to come together as a community to lessen the risk in the communities. The reason we say that there's no fire department in this country or no water system in the country that can successfully fight these fires is because there's not much mitigation within these communities. And so when you have all these homes on fire because they're not built for the wildland urban interface, you're completely overloading the suppression. And Kurt made a great point of, these urban fire departments are built to put out a singular structure fire, not an entire neighborhood. And so, how do we get that back? How do we get it so that the fire is controlled? We're successfully living with fire. We're not eliminating it, but we're getting back to that point where we might have a little bit of loss every single time, and I mean loss of infrastructure, not loss of life, hopefully. Um, but we're not having this catastrophic loss every single time. Um, the other part of it to get there is we need a common language to talk about these fires. There actually doesn't exist words on this planet to talk about the Marshall Fire versus the LA fires. We don't have metrics to compare fire intensities. And from the scientific point of view, and in my research world, this is something that we're working towards so that we can empower our communities to talk about this and to talk about it in varying gradations of intensities. So there's again, I could go on and on because there's a lot of that we need to be doing. But yeah, I think there's a lot of people acting in this space.
Well, what I'm hearing, Kurt, the other piece of this that I think we sometimes ignore, right? There's the expectation that I, as the homeowner, and I've got a beautiful community, and as part of that beautiful community, there's historic homes that built over generations that are not necessarily quote fireproof. Um, Landscaping was lush and beautiful, and that's why I want to live in that community. And are you seeing that are people going to have to adapt? Can they still get that expectation? If then that dialogue you were talking about on the misconception, if you will, of what the responsibility is for the homeowner, here's the community I wish to live in. Now here's my role in that and how I partner with the local community, local city, local county, water agency, etc.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of these communities have had a false sense of security. Obviously, Louisville being in the Marshall Fire, we were one of them. We thought we'd never have a wildfire in our community. It was something that we can see the mountains from our community, and they're a decent hike away. But we never thought a fire would come down from the mountains into our community. And in our particular fire, the fire started in kind of a grassland open space and was driven by hurricane force winds. So I think it's accepting the new realities of life again as the climate impacts continue to take hold and moving forward and understand that we do need to adapt. Erica mentioned the wildland urban interface, and I think a lot of people are learning what that means for them and what it might means for their home or their property and how to live in this environment as it's changing. And I think also attrition will take place. Like some people just don't want to accept the new reality, so they may move away from communities of high risk, and because the communities are taking ownership of the problem and creating different zoning codes or building codes or mitigation requirements that people don't agree with, or attrition may happen just because there was a fire and now those properties are lost and people may rebuild or may leave to other communities. So it's a complex topic to answer your question, and people are grappling with that.
Well, I think though, I mean, and the natural question as I sort of read that in the papers here, right? There's that long-term rebuild, or if you had the blank canvas, Erica, based upon the research you've done, you'd probably design communities differently than those that we saw taken out by some of the fires. But recognizing, so you don't have that blank canvas, um, do you? I mean, everybody wants to build back right away, fast, do it tomorrow. Again, it's immediate gratification. So how do I get what I had? How do I get what I had plus? And how do I do it within the next, 18 months? Is that all realistic? Or do we, when you have these issues, you have to go back and really kind of fundamentally redesign how the community is put together?
Well, I think it's a really hard reality to come to face with. And I can empathize with it. The house I grew up in was, a 1930s farmhouse in New York, surrounded by woods, and I appreciate these older homes and the historical value that they bring to communities. And I don't think that we have to get rid of that. I think that it is a misconception that we have to kind of get rid of all character in the community and just get rid of all the trees and make it a moonscape, and that's what our new reality is. But I think there's a lot that we can be doing to make our communities beautiful, and there's like some really amazing work happening, throughout the West, in places like Montana, that are doing some great mitigation, and they're not chopping down all their trees around their homes. Um, but what you're bringing up is the kind of high dense urban environment, and when we kind of have this existing landscape, it's really hard, to make those changes. We all, I kind of, I equate a lot of, the wildfire issue to COVID. And I do that because we all went through it together. We all did it. And so some of us have never lived through some sort of natural hazard disaster. But we all went through COVID. And I think we can all realize that the before COVID times, before 2020, no longer exists. We're in a new reality, a new world, and change is really hard. But we have come through it on the other side. And in some ways, it's better. Look at us right now. We're all on some sort of, media platform. We didn't have to fly to Los Angeles to meet with you. And we're able to connect with one another virtually. And that became more mainstream during those pandemic times. In Los Angeles, January 6th, 2025, and the community that existed on January 6th, 2025 doesn't exist anymore. Those times don't exist anymore. The people that lived there are now displaced. Some might not come back, some might come back. But there's going to be rebuilding for almost a decade. It's going to take a lot of time. And I'm sure Kurt can talk about how they're still rebuilding in Colorado. And so it's something different now. But what's exciting about that is it's up to the people who want to engage and protect that community and have such an emotional tie to those beautiful communities that can make it that something different that is also adaptable to fire. So it's really in the power of those people to make it something that this doesn't happen again, rather than rebuilding very quickly to what was there before.
Right. Well, Kurt, you get that handoff, right? You've got the pace of change. You've been through the fire, and I'll say it because lots won't. That it's easier for a political figure to say, "Hey, make this happen. Just make it happen." Right? Aspirational. I'm going to wave my magic wand, and then they're going to turn to you, and they're going to say, "Why isn't it done yet?" So, how have you seen things change in your community post fire? And how did you manage the expectations of, I want it now?
Yeah, I mean, in our fire, we did not have the WUI code, the Wildland Urban Interface, and that code was introduced in our community shortly after our fire because we were starting that rebuild phase. However, there was pushback actually on that because another problem that we haven't discussed yet is just insurance and underinsurance and the amount of the amount of money that people have to work with to rebuild their lives under the time frames, like you said, 18 months. So there was actually pushback in our community against the WUI code because it was going to add to the cost of the homes. And so people were allowed through the process to not build to WUI, but they didn't necessarily always qualify for all the rebates that were possible if they weren't building to WUI. So we had a mixture. And I would say, to answer the question, it's the politicians can adapt quickly if they have the courage, but it's really the pace of which the community will accept the changes. And so now, 3 years later, we're having more conversations about home hardening and WUI code and those types of things. And I think people are taking a little more serious. To try to do it in the beginning is really tough because everyone's in shock and money's on their mind and they just want to get their lives back. So I think it really is contextually dependent on the community and what they've been through in the past and what they're going through after their fire, and more importantly, what their financial means are to rebuild.
So I got a follow up then. It's like, so if I'm focused as a homeowner, completely get it, right? I lost my house. I'm dealing now with insurance companies and with FEMA and with the city and the county, and I got lots of people and lots of help and tools and things, at my disposal, which is the good news. Bad news is I got all these other entities claiming, offering help and assistance. I just want my life back together, right? So I just want to go, and I can understand where the frustration comes in pretty quickly there. But having said that, right, for you then specific to the water system, there were some things I think ultimately. Did you end up building back the way you had it, or did you make modifications? Did you do any upsizing, anything that would be sort of forecasting the future as opposed to that build back what you had before the fires?
Yeah, in our situation, our main infrastructure survived the fire well. We had some fire hydrants that were singed per se, but everything survived well. The major changes we made were more incremental. So, something that happens in a wildfire is as it burns through a neighborhood, a water system loses water through firefighters fighting the fire, just the amount of hoses trying to put out a fire, but also every house that burns. Imagine kind of a garden hose just turned on and running full blast. And so you have a wide open garden hose at every house as it burns, and these houses burn within 15 or 20 minutes. You end up with thousands of garden hoses running. So you run out of water, death by a thousand cuts. So our incremental change is we're installing metering systems in our neighborhoods that we're rebuilding where we have two things going on. We have a remote shutoff valve that we can activate that'll shut down the water service to a home or to a structure. And that's something that we've implemented that we never had before in our rebuild areas. And then also, uh, California does a good job with backflow preventers, but Colorado, it's not necessarily a standard. But we also installed backflow preventers on our water services. So that keeps water going back into the system. During the fire, you get these superheated gases, and as the water lines depressurize, these superheated gases get pulled into the water system, and you get these residuals, these contaminants that no one ever even really understood until about 5, 6 years ago. So our upgrades have been to keep water from flowing into structures if they burn, and then to keep water flowing back into our system around the area where we meter water.
So, Erica, having just kind of come out of Los Angeles and then kind of adding to the research you've already done, is there anything in the LA fire areas that sort of struck you that as opportunities that if the local water systems may want to approach and make sure that that infrastructure is put in place before,
Yeah.
or I guess in this case simultaneously while people are trying to build back for those who have the financial means to do that?
Yeah, I mean, everything Kurt just mentioned is also being installed throughout Oregon in the recovery from the 2020 Labor Day fires as well. So those remote shutoff valves are incredibly powerful. In the Palisades fire, um, the fire lasted for so long, and so much of the community was on fire at the same time that they couldn't actually send people into the field to shut the water off at the curb stop, as Kurt and his team did in the Marshall fire. It was just too dangerous. So, in the Palisades fire, they, you know, they're the wind was so strong that they couldn't deploy aerial firefighting starting around 4 p.m. on the first day. At 5 p.m. they lost water, so they ordered water tenders from LA Division of Water and Power. Those, it takes a while to get them, so those didn't come until 3 in the morning. So that was a 10-hour window where there wasn't water. And that was during the highest winds. And so when you look at the fire progression maps, they just explode during that time period. And so, these remote water shutoff valves are incredible to be able to, one, shut the water off at the homes as they're leaking water, as Kurt described, but two, to do it in a way where you're not putting people's lives at risk in a very dangerous situation. And to do it very quickly, too, to be able to do it a lot faster. So I think like those are fantastic opportunities there for the community to think about. But there was also depressurization both in the Eaton fire perimeter as well as in the Palisades fire perimeter. And so installing the backflow preventers, it's not only helps, like to suck in ash and soot from the air, but any residual water from firefighting efforts that could come back in. There were massive rains and landslides, and so that could be also, sucked back into the water distribution system. And so what we often see is Public Works will go around and shut the valve off at burned down homes, but also sever the service line and cap the water meter to prevent anything from coming back, whether it's firefighting debris, air, whatever it is. And all of this is cumbersome. It takes time. So anything that we can do to take advantage of new technology that makes it faster, safer, and we can get to that recovery point a little bit faster.
And just out of curiosity, because I don't really know that much about it, sounds simple. Is it simple to install and relatively inexpensive, or do these become, for significant engineering, so I got to redesign the system to put that kind of stuff in?
Yeah, in the context of Louisville, many of our meters are inside a home. So in our burn areas, it's like a clean slate. So it's easy to install this new type of metering system outside during the rebuild. But for us, it's substantial cost if we want to retrofit the rest of our community to move meters from the inside to the outside. So I think it's really contextual on the system and if they already have metering outside or if it's inside. Luckily for us, I mean, the neighborhoods that had the impact and are rebuilding are kind of on the perimeter of our city. And so having these metering systems as kind of a first line of defense worked out for us. But other communities, there might be financial decisions that are large. Yeah.
Sure. All right. So I gotta, as long as I'm then, you all talked about it. Then once you have the fire take place, there are issues that a lot of people don't even think about, and that things like water quality, depending upon the pipes, depending upon what they're pulling in, right? As you described, Kurt. So explain to folks that may not fully get that. So what are some of the issues around water quality? What kind of things can happen or did you see happen? And do some of these mitigation efforts that you're talking about, does that also address sort of future water quality? Or is that just one of those things that people need to help understand? It's like, okay, we got to flush the system out. We got to rebuild the system a different way so that we don't have these things in the future. And, oh yeah, by the way, you're going to have these water quality issues. You're going to have these restrictions for a while because this too is not easy just to get cleaned up. You can't just flip a switch and then have the thing all be pristine again.
Yeah, the contaminants, it's kind of like we're just talking about the remote shutoffs. The remote shutoff's kind of like a Band-Aid. Imagine your body, you're just trying to close maybe an open wound and you don't want that infection to get through your body and you don't want to leave that wound open. So these contaminants, they can get into your main lines. And the good news is we're learning community by community, you can decontaminate, but there is an education with your populace that can take anywhere from days up to months, depending on where the contamination is and how it impacted your system. In some cases, if communities aren't able to kind of attack the flushing procedures right away, it's possible that there has to be some replacement of infrastructure like the water lines under the street. So, I just feel like the common language that Erica discussed is what we're trying to develop so that when a fire happens, we have a way to communicate with the general public clearly on this is what's in your water and these are timelines to safely recover the system, as well as a common language for the water entities that are impacted and understanding what they're dealing with and then how to deal with it quickly.
Right. So Erica, so given all of this, you were going to say something. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to kind of go through the mechanism. So when you have a home burning, it is releasing a lot of heat, a lot of energy. In the West, this actually wasn't in within the LA city limits. This is not an issue, but most of the West Coast and in a lot of places throughout the country, we use plastic service laterals. That's the pipe that goes from your water meter to your house, or from the water main, those big pipes underneath the street, to your house. And when those are heated, they thermally degrade. So with heat, they're degrading and they're releasing volatile organic compounds into the water distribution system because they're breaking down, the material's breaking down. At the same time, Kurt mentioned the demands that the firefighters are putting on the water distribution system. It's basically completely maxed out. And so when every single home burns down, you have that garden hose leaking at every single home. And if a firefighter down the street is putting maximum demand on the hydrant, that water system is pulling on everything. And what you can have is local depressurization, where the ash and soot in the air is sucked into that
Oh,
service lateral, that pipe, and then that ash and soot is circulated around the water distribution system. Now, that ash and soot we know has volatile organic compounds, semi-volatile organic compounds. All of these are carcinogens and nasty chemicals. And what we've seen in our research, because we've actually like simulated this in like full scale, is that this ash and soot really sticks to the inside of pipes, typically more so in plastic pipes than in metal pipes. And even after you flush, you're still seeing some contaminants in those plastic pipes. And we think it's because the plastic pipes are absorbing the contaminants and then releasing it back into the water. And so what can also happen, and why I mentioned like the firefighting and the rains, is that anything can be sucked back into that. So if you have active like firefighting runoff, it can be sucked back into that water distribution system. And so these are the mechanisms in which you can get this contamination there. And I'm talking about post water treatment plant. So after the water treatment plant, there's ways that you can get contamination in your source water as well. But within the distribution system, this is what you can get. And so when you're flushing the system, you're trying to get rid of all that ash and soot that has been sucked into your system. And the repairs, oftentimes what we've seen throughout California and Oregon, if they do use plastic service laterals, is that they are replacing the service lateral at every single burned down home. So they'll shut down the water distribution system, around the areas that were burned, let the rest of the community recover. And then as homes are rebuilding, part of their certificate of occupancy is to replace that service lateral. So, as Kurt mentioned, this can take forever. It can take a really long time.
yeah.
So it took Santa Rosa and Paradise almost a year to recover from
Wow.
this. In Oregon, we're still recovering from it because we're replacing our pipes. And so it's just a massive burden onto the community when they're first trying to figure out what happened, where is the source of this, and then how do we actually recover from it.
Yeah, I got my lot cleared. Let me go. So, Kurt, it
Yeah.
sounds like as you open in the recovery piece of this, the coordination between public works, water agency, wastewater agency, electric utilities, gas utilities, telecommunications, all of whom are going to be, in my words, kind of like on top of each other, trying to do their replacement, do their upgrades, because you may have some things in the water industry you want to do differently. The electric guys clearly are going to want to do something differently, given people's use of electric transportation and cars and stuff. They're looking 30, 40, 50 years out, and like the Palisades, right, the old electric system ain't going to cut it, so they've got to do their own upgrades. That sounds to me like a monumental coordination effort. How do you go through that? How do you make sure that everybody sort of is talking to each other, cooperating with each other, not getting on top of each other and, hey, I got to get my stuff done first and get out of the way? How do you make that coordination happen?
Yeah, I mean, it is monumental. I think the good news around that is before a fire all these utilities have their location in life already kind of figured out. They live in things called easements. So these are
There.
rights of way, places where the power line was planned to be or the water line was planned to be. So utility companies, we're good at working together prior to fire, and we do that every day. What happens is our timelines get expedited after a fire to recover, but the process of working together is pretty natural for us. So some of the bigger challenges are just trying to figure out what was actually damaged, like how much and where. And then, as you said, then people want to have the conversation about, well, then while we're rebuilding or repairing, let's upgrade. And so these types of things take a lot of meetings and a lot of brain power and a lot of years to figure out. Unfortunately, sometimes what happens is you end up just putting back in what you had before because you don't have time to dream and design and fund a whole overhaul of a system. But in some cases, and hopefully in California's case, some longer term visioning, there's time for that, and they can do the upgrades as well.
So
It also becomes really challenging when you have multiple. So in the Eaton Fire perimeter, there's at least 4 different water districts. So
and all very small ones.
Yeah, it's hard enough when you have one. But, when you have all of these different water districts and people's neighbors are on a different water district than them, and like, how do you sync up messaging and make sure everyone's recovering the same way? It can become really complicated.
Well, I was going to ask, and I think you're right? Small agencies, big agencies, how do you work in the LA experience, which is what I know. There's the county, there's the cities, there's the small municipals, and then there's the sanitation. So you got all those different levels of government. And then I was going to ask, then added to that complexity, right? Again, you're sort of looking forward. You've got those issues of, okay, what should the coordination be going forward with the fire department? And what should that coordination be with your county, your state, in some cases, your federal, your forestry type stuff? Do we have the right coordination mechanisms? Do we have efficient government in that respect? Or are there some lessons that you've seen in Los Angeles so we could probably also learn from that and how to better coordinate these things?
I mean, I think right after the fire, you have a lot of different agencies coming in and you do facilitated learning analysis, and that might be through different federal agencies, state agencies, and even local agencies. So there's a lot of debrief and then lessons learned happening. Now, how these roll up to kind of federal lessons, those lessons roll up into like FEMA or the Forest Service, but then a lot of these lessons are I think really it's up to the people that have been at fires to really promote how to be resilient moving forward. And I know Erica can go deeper into this stuff, but for at least the water situation, there wasn't a lot of guidance the day after our fire. We found Erica and her team from Oregon State through Purdue, who had a professor named Andy Welton that was on Twitter at the time suggesting that there were these contaminants. And so in our fire, we had to fly everybody in. Like on a Tuesday, I reached out to Purdue University and said, hey, what do you know about this stuff? Because we're being told we have all these contaminants in our system. We don't really understand the science behind this. And Andy started to download a lot of good information. I just said, hey, I'm going to pay for your ticket, but you're going to get on a plane today, and I need you here tomorrow. And by the way, bring whoever else knows about this stuff because we need them. I'm in a pickle. And so Erica and her team came, and we had also some folks from University of Colorado. So there was no guidance. We had to kind of collect it and bring it all together. And then we had all these people helping us. We said, hey, this isn't right that we're having to figure this out like this. Let's create some sort of guiding manual, some sort of draft document that we can use for our recovery, but maybe we can hand off to others. And luckily that's evolved into some Water Research Foundation projects that now there's somewhat of a published manual around this that establishes a common language. So in some cases, things are efficient, the facilitated learning analysis type of protocols where you debrief. And in some cases, we're still learning, and it takes grassroots to kind of create the common language and the manuals, and it's still going to take a long time.
So I just had a flashback to that old Super Bowl commercial about, flying the airplane while you're building it, which is
Yeah.
literally what it sounded like you were doing there. It's like, hey, I don't know, but find me somebody, anybody, because we're now going to start putting bolts back on this thing.
Yeah, and the other challenge that happens is in the water environment, especially, everything we operate by is through the EPA, through regulatory recommendations or guidelines. We have limits of how many contaminants can be in a water system. When a disaster happens and the water system gets contaminated, and there's no guidance on that, unfortunately, the regulators can only go so far because they have to follow laws and they
Mm.
can't start to make up laws. And so your relationship gets reversed. As the water system, you actually have to learn how to regulate yourself and propose a solution to your regulator that they can thumbs up and say, yes, that protocol of how you are going to decontaminate your system and ensure your water is safe, we approve of that. But a regulator can't come in and tell you what protocol you should do or how to do that. And so everything kind of locks up. And so that's another challenge
Yeah.
that happens is just the relationships flip and you have to be the lead versus just following the rules. And people aren't don't know what to do with that.
So, Erica, other than getting a lot of frequent flyer miles, which should set you up for some travel when you finally got some time off, if the disasters would, kind of minimize themselves, you could take time off. What are you seeing as sort of advice, sort of on the macro perspective, sort of to help communities get over recovery? And in this case, obviously, we're talking about fire recovery. But as we open the discussion, I mean, there are other places have tornadoes and they have hurricanes and there's flooding. It strikes me that, the issue about community impact and disaster recovery, kind of lots of these same sort of lessons. We just happen to be talking about fire in this particular scenario. I mean, I can go to any Hollywood movie, that post-apocalyptic, once the big one in California hits and the San Andreas Fault, and 10 communities are on fire, and all these things are happening at one time, there won't be the kind of resources. So we sort of saw in LA, so that microcosm. So as we're advising communities, whether they're new communities or in the rebuild, what two or three things do you see as really important? And then for both of you, the follow-up is, then how do we get the public to not only understand, but then to contribute to the solution?
So I think really what it comes down to is, when we run our our fire models, there's a lot of researchers in the United States, myself included, who can run fire propagation models through communities. We're running them and we're stopping at just, these are the homes that are destroyed.
Mm-hmm.
But we need to be able to identify our vulnerabilities in our communities, and that goes beyond housing. And so what we've been calling it here at Oregon State is strategic fire planning. So how do we get public works in the room, the fire service in the room, as well as the building department and the community, to talk about the fire is going to propagate through the community. Now, are the firefighters going to go? Where should they go to limit the fire spread? What portions of your community could catch fire and expose the rest of your town?
Mm-hmm.
What portions of your community are most vulnerable to catching fire, and which ones have the least water capacity? So you talked about what future adaptations we can do. So all of this is all tied together of where are the firefighters going to go? Where should they go? Where are the most vulnerable areas of our community, not just in housing stock, but the people who live there, and the capacity of the water systems. So we can strategically identify where the weak points in the community are before the fire, right? Before the communities are impacted, and do a full system analysis. And that's a lot of the research that we're doing here, and building upon a lot of our previous work. And then coming to the public and saying, yeah, we're going to send our firefighters here, because if these areas catch fire, if the fire intrudes this way and these areas catch fire, they're going to expose the rest of town. We need to fight there. Mm-hmm. And so therefore we have to boost our water distribution system in those areas to have the capacity to do so. And so the science needs to, progress there, right? When we talk about, you talked about these other hazards, when we run our earthquake models, we look at our regional simulations for earthquakes, we don't just look at the number of buildings that are damaged. We talk about pipelines, we talk about electricity, we talk about social vulnerability, we talk about the recovery phase, and we talk about all the major infrastructure components: healthcare, school systems, roads. How are people getting out? How are people getting around? Can we actually get goods and services post earthquake from one side of the town to the other side of the town? And yet we don't do this for wildfires, right? So we need to start looking beyond just these homes are going to burn down, which is catastrophic and unfortunate, but there's more infrastructure in our town that is very critical to the recovery, that is beyond just the homes, and we need to keep pushing forward in that, as we have for all these other hazards.
Well, it strikes me. I mean, it was a running joke back in the 90s, and I think we got to bring the joke back here in California, that the four seasons in California were fire, flood, earthquake, and riots. And it seems like that's kind of the norm rather than, the summer, winter, spring, and fall. That's just sort of our reality, and how do you deal with that? So I have to ask both of you this question, because at the end of the day, I mean, it's kind of, yes, it's our rose-colored glasses here at the Southern California Water Coalition. But as you described, Kurt, the working relationship with others, how important is it in external communications? How important is it to be inclusive with your constituents, with the agencies you work with? I'm always kind of looking for sort of where does that communications piece come in, where it's easy to talk about, oh, I can engineer it, I can build it, and get it going. But as you described, that doesn't happen without a lot of it feels frustrating with meetings, conversation, coordination. Any special sort of community engagement tools, techniques, advice that you think are also important to sort of overlay when we're dealing with the physical infrastructure and the physical response?
I mean, the planning process for, let's say, like upgrades or working together, it's a multi-year process where you have many public meetings to gather input and concerns from people, and work with your partners like the fire department to say, like, hey, if this is the area of risk, how do we prioritize the water system in that area? So, yeah, I mean, I think all those things have transparency. Ultimately, it's going to come down to dollars and cents. You can walk into any public meeting and someone says, I totally want the water system upgraded, and I want all the bells and whistles so my house will never burn again. And so you say, okay, and we'll put a price to that. And now your water bill is going to be another $100 a month for your water bill. And everyone says, whoa, time out. So I think it really comes down to best practices are the most effective. And best practices might be like just working directly with the fire department, like Erica said, and said, where are the pinch points in the system, upgrading the low-hanging fruit of the pinch points. Also, just kind of rethinking your system. If today or if tomorrow my water system is purely going to fight fire and it doesn't have to service drinking water, what would I do differently? So in our case, in our fire, we needed to push more water into our system. We were running out of water. We opened up a valve to let a whole reservoir just flow into our system to keep it pressurized, no treated water. And so we had to recover just from lake water being in our system, in addition to the contaminants. So it's like, it's talking through what you have, what you can do, low hanging fruit to improve things today, and then doing some of that dream, but realizing you probably can't. So you got to do a lot of small best practices, mitigation efforts on the surrounding areas, home hardening. All the things matter. There's no like silver bullet.
Okay.
I
Erica, how
think
about
also
you? What kind of lessons have you seen? Because again, we tend to simplify stuff, right? Well, if you were in Los Angeles and you had a fire, you've got that ocean right off there, and I didn't know that. You can't really use ocean water to fight fires. That creates a whole nother set of issues when you
no,
start
you
dropping salt
can.
water.
You can use, and they were given permission to draft from the ocean. I mean, that's what the planes do, right? They go and they pick up the ocean water. So they just the firefighters didn't
Just
use
didn't.
it. It does create some issues like in your system, but I mean, if they need the water, they're going to use whatever's around them.
Yep.
I think it's, a lot of, I agree with a lot of what Kurt is saying. It's, you can't do these mitigations overnight. None of this is happening in a singular year or even over the course of 3 years or 5 years. These communities were built up over decades and decades, and you're not going to mitigate with a snap of a finger. So these, developments of community wildfire preparedness plans, making 10-year strategies and strategic choices to stage this mitigation. Everything we've talked about today costs money, and it's unreasonable to ask for communities to do this overnight and all in one shot, and also it's highly disruptive to just their economics and their social patterns. So how do we do this, bit by bit, where you're choosing some home mitigations to implement within your community through ordinances or through volunteer programs. You're choosing, where exactly you need to add capacity to your water systems, where the most vulnerable areas of your electrical systems are. I think we all know like these communities need added capacity, but really taking that time to understand where and what does it mean? Is it people? Is it infrastructure? Is it home hardening? Is it defensible? What does that mean? And how do you roll that out over, a period of time so that it's acceptable to the community, and they're not stuck with $100 more on their water bill or whatever it is, or their roads are being all torn up all over the place. I think there just needs to be plans, and sometimes, and I think going back all the way to your kind of your first question of these quick recoveries, when we recover quickly, it's too quickly to even make a plan. And so, sometimes, these quick recoveries are not good recoveries. And so taking the time, which is painful, and it's easy for me to sit here and say, and so I feel for the people wanting to rebuild quickly, but taking the time to make those plans, and strategically to make choices in the community that are going to make it safer for the future.
Well, what I'm hearing from both of you is it depends, right? You need to be very strategic. It depends on where you are, what your conditions. Not every mitigation measure needs to be taken in every circumstance. You want to make smart investments in the right place at the right time. And what I'm hearing from both of you is that it's managing expectations, and the coordination, the communication really becomes very important as you take science, you take lessons learned, and then you put best practices in place and move expeditiously so that you're looking, I'll use the term, an efficient rebuild, not an immediate rebuild. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it's well put.
Okay. Well, Erica and Kurt, I cannot thank you enough for spending time with us to try to help understand this. I mean, clearly we've been very insulated with lots of things happening over the last month or so. People responding to it. It's very refreshing to get an outside perspective and somebody who's had to deal with this on their own, and to take those lessons learned. I very much appreciate both of you being with us again on What Matters Water, TV, and Podcast. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Much.
Well, thanks for joining us on What Matters Water, TV, and Podcast. If you like this discussion, go to wherever you download your podcasts and give us that 5-star rating. Give us comments. Give us suggestions. If you're on YouTube, subscribe to our channel. That'll help us build our presence in this new world and in this format. And if you're interested in helping sponsor this program, please reach out to us at SoCalWater.org and send us a message. As we close today's show, I leave you with this challenge. Be a part of the conversation. Be a part of the solution. At Southern California Water Coalition, we educate to advocate. So as public policy leaders have difficult choices, together we help them make informed decisions. Thanks for being with us. We'll see you again next time on What Matters, Water, TV, and Podcast.